Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. In previous episodes, we've seen instances of Ray showing that he is smart. I mean, he is a college educated man, sports writer, knows his stuff. And in addition to him being kind of a man child, there are some things that he is ignorant of, whether it be in greater life or, more likely, within the marriage. This is another example of something that Ray is ignorant of involving his marriage that probably at one point he had to do himself, but given how the situation is, he probably went to mommy for help, but they never talk on it, so that's just me assuming. And that is balancing the checkbook. And that is, funny enough, what this episode is called. The Checkbook. Episode 16 of Season 2. Like the previous episode and the letter, for me at least, this is one of the early classic episodes. And I haven't said it in a bit. This is an episode that, while you technically could have done the basic plot anytime, it makes sense to place it in the earlier seasons. I say Season 2 is definitely the best place to put this one, but it would have been at home in Season 3. Probably would have gotten lost in the shuffle with all the great Season 3 episodes, but Season 2 definitely. Now, if this had been a Season 1 episode, it would have been the de facto first classic episode. And it's a very simple premise, but the way the actors work off each other, the writing and everything, make it a great episode. The teleplay was written by Tom, and forgive me if I butchered this pronunciation, Caltabiano, who also wrote Golf, the season opener. He's going to write another episode later in the season, 6 Feet Under, another good one. Next season he wrote Lone Barone, and in the later season he wrote Jazz Records, which I believe that's season 8. That's actually one of my favorite episodes of that season. You move these records! And he's also a story editor on Cruising with Marie, another great episode. Sorry for that phone call. But he understands these characters, he understands the relationships between them, and then that's where the meat and potatoes of both the drama and the comedy stem from. And with this episode, Josie really understands the relationship between Ray and Debra, that they love each other, but there's also that little conflict. He understands Ray's relationship with his family members, that he loves to go behind Debra's back, which is another great episode that highlights that, which is like, really, Ray, you can't just admit to your mistake? Like, you're just trying to fix it instead of admitting to it, and you probably could have been helped out a lot sooner. The plot of the episode is that begins on what seems to be an average afternoon. Debra's at the table doing the budget, going through the checkbook. Ray walks in, asks her to write out a check for a Sports Illustrated subscription. It ran out. Debra's like, hey, that's a waste of money. They get into a minor argument. It's not a full-fledged. It's more like a weird discussion. And they both make good points. I mean, Ray's like, it's just one thing for me. Debra's like, well, we're living within a budget. Who's the golf club for? Ray doesn't really have a retort to that because it's like, yeah, who's the golf club for? Is it for Allie? Then Ray says something that really pushes it over the line for Debra. And it's an insensitive comment, and it shows that sometimes, not sometimes, a lot of the times, Ray says something that you can definitely tell that his brain always is catching up with his mouth, and that is, why don't you just pay the bills? That really annoys Debra to the point where she's like, alright, you think it's so easy? You pay the bills. And of course Ray thinks it's going to be easy at first, because like I said at the beginning, he's probably done this before, so it's been a while, he's a little rusty, it's like getting back on a bike. Well, the next scene cuts to 6 weeks later. He's going to go talk with Andy at Nemo's, which is a nice little gag of Angelina really blowing everybody off. Like, how you doing? Nothing. Which is kind of funny, but it's one of those games like, that's weird. She's never been like that before, and the next time we see her, she's not like that. Sometimes you have a bad day. Well, Andy looks through the checkbook, looks through a lot of the notes that Ray has, and he has overdrawn his account. Part of it is that he paid so much on his Visa card. It's like, why'd you pay that in? Why'd you pay so much? They're paying full, no interest charges, which ate up a lot of his money, a lot of his excess liquidity. Which, as a kid, I didn't really grasp the humor behind that joke, but now as an adult, having credit cards of my own, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in that. You never pay in full like that, because then that eats up all the money. Unless, you got more than enough, but that's a whole other thing. And then just watching this and just seeing how Ray's floundering with all this, it's like, you have to keep track of everything, Ray. And like, I know that in the 20 years since this episode was produced, there is a lot more different things, a lot more stuff with online baking, keeping track of all your stuff online. Some not as many people using checks. Because I remember as a kid, my grandparents, both of them, still used a lot of checks. But now, even my grandmother I live with, I think she rarely, if ever, uses checks, and I've never used checks. I've cashed checks, both from financial aid and from work, but I've never actually written any. I don't even think I still have my initial checkbook they give you when you open your account. That's how rarely, how much I don't use them. If anything, I just use my debit card or go to the bank and then pull money out and use it. But because of that, it's a lot. But because of the changes that have been made, it's a lot easier to keep track of your expenditures and all that, or at least to me is, because you can just go on the app. Like, my app is right here. Like see, my app is right there in the financial thing. If I want to keep track, or there's something like, wait a minute, that's not going to be there, just go in there and be like, all right. Which there have been some times where I've had to do that, but because of the fact I always like to keep at least 1,000 in my savings, I'm always good. Like to. After getting the car, I'm still a little bit down, but that's a whole other situation. With Ray, even though Debra mentioned something about putting money away, it seems to be for the kids, so I'm guessing it's in a separate account from their main one. And I'm guessing he doesn't want to touch it because, one, it's the kids, two, if Debra ever did look at it, she'd be like, why is there money missing from the kids' account? It's one of those weird things. Could also be she's only the one who has access to it. Kind of like how Marie has her own separate account from Frank with the money that was given to her by her father and money she's been saving slowly. Well, Andy does start to help Ray going through all this, and he's talking about, you got to take the balances, you got to look at what the interest is, you got to look at the discretionary funds and all that. And the way Ray's just looking at him like, you could just be talking in Spanish or in some other foreign language, and Ray does not understand what you're saying. Which I kind of do understand, because even just hearing the terms is like, I have no idea what he's talking about. But doing a Google search is like, oh, that's what I mean. And even though Ray later says he stinks at numbers, which I do agree with something like this, it should be easy. And later, Debra doesn't even throw that back in his face, like, if it's golf, you win. Which it's, yeah. Because with me, it's mainly higher math I don't get, like algebra and all that. Like, why am I looking for X? When am I ever going to use this? But like, balancing the checkbook, pretty easy, even though it's all done here. Ray, I have to agree with Debra's later point. It seems to be more of he doesn't want to do it, rather than he can't do it. And for this, it's just he thought it was going to be easier. He didn't keep track of everything. He made that mistake with the Visa card. And now he's in a rut. Now, the common sense thing would be like, okay, you're in a rut. You got to go find Debra. You got to get some more money somehow. You got to get her to help it. But Ray's pride and him not wanting to admit when he's wrong, he's like, no. So he decides for that front, he's going to make a fake checkbook in case Debra decides to ask, which this is the last time we see Andy in the episode, so it makes you wonder what he's thinking about it, because we do see his kind of back reaction, but it makes you wonder, like, if Debra had confronted Andy, would he have broken, or would he have been like, no, nothing happened, nothing. Sorry, regular, she's looking at me. I could see something like that happen. Well, the fake checkbook goes off without a hitch. Debra thinks that he is doing everything successfully. And that scene does end kind of funny because, right, he's about to turn out the light, and then the power goes out because he bounced that check. Perfect timing. Too convenient timing, if you think about it, because what would have happened if that power had gone out sooner? Well, we find that in a later scene, because apparently that check gets bounced, and the ending scene, or second to last scene, ends with the power going out again. Now, one front is finished, and that is Ray doing the fake checkbook, but then where's he going to get the money from? Like I've already mentioned, it's not like he has other accounts he can draw from, or at least they don't touch on it. So, he decides to call in a family member. Now, as we know, Marie has plenty of money. She'd be able to loan Ray to $3,000 easily. However, asking the bank of mom for help comes with its own questions, because she'd be like, why do you gotta borrow money from me, dear? What is it? Is it Debra, dear? What's going on? And with how Marie is, you know she would go across the street, talk with Debra, and then Debra would find out one way, and then Ray'd be like, "Oh my God." He could try to ask Frank, but I don't see Frank doing it unless it's a big emergency. I mean, look how he was dragging his feet when it came to the gambling money. So he decides to ask his brother if he has any money. And when he finds out why, of course, being a cop, he thinks it might be for stuff is like, you don't have any gambling issues, do you? Which, being a police sergeant, it's pretty standard and logical that that would be where his mind would go first, especially since they live on Long Island and it is the 90s. If it was the 80s, the would make a little bit more sense, but Long Island still probably makes a little bit more sense, especially since they live in a semi-affluent neighborhood, and he is a sports writer. That whole little drugs and sports little connection that they never mentioned, but I think it's supposed to be a more subtextual thing that the audience is supposed to put two and two together. One thing I like about this is that this could have been the perfect moment for Robert to really hold this over Ray's head. He kind of does a little bit when he asks, "So you need my help?" And the way Brad Garrett plays it, you could tell that Robert is enjoying this a little bit. But he decides to help him. I mean, they're family. I know for some people they'd be like, "Yeah, that only goes so far," which I do agree with. There are certain family members that would only go so far with. One of them would being that if I saw them on fire on the side of the road, I'd be like, "I don't care." But I'm not going to mention that here. But for the ones that you do care about, your family, you do want to try and help them. And Robert here shows that even though him and Cubby, as he calls him affectionately, might have their differences, he might have some resentment over the fact Marie favors him, but at the end of the day, they are brothers and he is going to help him. I mean, the ending part of the scene is like, "How about you, Raymond? How you doing? Do you need help?" And of course, this is the second part of Ray's lie in this whole situation. First one was the fake checkbook. Here, he lies to Robert about why he needs the money. He doesn't tell him the whole thing about him making the mistake with it, even though with Robert it probably would have made a little more sense to come straight up. He lies and says that Debra is spending too much money, which a thing about her getting her nails done comes back to bite her in the next scene, because we find out that Robert told Frank and Marie. At least that's the way it comes off. It could also come off that he mentioned a little bit, gave him the check to give to Ray inside the envelope. They looked inside and they're like $3,000. The way the dialogue plays, I think he mentioned the spending problems that he was loaning Ray money, but didn't specify the amount, so they got nosy and opened it. This leads to a little argument between Frank and Marie about Robert paying rent, which is like, really? He's not paying rent? All right. Not even a little bit? Which is an issue that Frank brings up time and again before Robert moves out. Kind of a little funny running gag. Before Ray can deposit the check, Debra has to get a check from him because she can't find his ATM card and he doesn't have cash on him. He gives her a blank check, and it's during this little moment that Frank says one of my favorite little lines that is just a brief line, but it's funny. "A blank check? You're dumber than I tell people." You're telling people your son is stupid? Oh, well. I guess it's different strokes for different folks there. But also in this is the moment where that little nail thing comes back to bite Debra, because she shows him off to Marie after Marie mentions to Ray that they know about Debra's problem, and then she says to Ray, "See, Ray was worth the money." Because in an earlier scene, he complained about the price. It's like, $20, that's a buck a nail. And there's like, "Oh no." You remember, context. Well, after this whole fiasco, we get to a scene that has no dialogue. It's all done through body language. Or should I say no audible dialogue. Where Ray gets to the bank right after Debra. He tries to go deposit in the ATM outside. He has to cut in front of an old lady who goes to get a cop. The cop turns out to be Robert. Tries to help him. They're trying to get the check in while Debra is slowly making her way to the front. She's at the next teller. Another cop comes up and is supposed to be a lieutenant who is played in a cameo by Ray's retired police brother, Richard. You get a little salute thing, which Robert totally does the salute wrong. I actually forgot about that. He does it totally exaggerated. And of course, they both take Ray away. Never mentions what happens, whether he gets booked or not, or whether he's just dragged away because of cutting, and then he explains all what happened. I can imagine the LT probably looks at Robert and goes, "Your brother?" "Yes, sir." Oh, try and keep him in check. But what makes this whole situation funny, other than this pantomime, is how both sides realize the other one is watching. Because at the end, The kids first see Ray outside being dragged away by his brother and another cop. Then Debra and the teller look over, and Ray's like, "Eh." Now, we never find out what the discussion between Debra and the teller is, but I like to imagine it's around that point that Debra finds out there's nothing in the account that she can use right at that moment, or there's only limited funds. And then in between this and the next scene, she has a little heart-to-heart with Ray where he admits everything, and then the next scene is her trying to fix everything. And that's where we get that whole thing about Ray being lazy when it comes to the numbers of the checkbook. And she compares him to the kids with that. It's like, you're like the kids. You only like to do what's fun. Which the kids you can kind of understand. But her point still stands. Ray, when it comes to stuff like this, is lazy. He really needs to get his act together and step up. But then again, if he did that from a character standpoint, which would make sense, there'd be no show. Just like if you lock the door, there'd be no show. Even though they do it a couple times. Although it'd be nice to see some slight maturity from Ray, even if you could keep some of his other mannerisms in check. And we do see some growth from Robert over the course of the show, but we also see some regression in a couple of areas, which I'll get to when we get to those episodes. The end gag is Marie and Frank taking care of Deborah's credit card, which is a nice little end joke. In Syndication, I believe that scene is still retained. The only edit I remember from Syndication is the opening scene they cut out a little bit, and the episode proper begins with, "Have you ever looked at our budget?" Which is a little jarring, but I remember being edited to the point where it starts in mid-conversation, and then you can pick up like, oh, they're arguing about budget. It's a weird cut, but it works. It's not like the other ones where you're like, really? On the whole, this is a great episode. The performances all blend together well. Frank and Marie are the ones that are used the least of the main characters, but they're used well enough to get the point across. They're, for the episode, anti-Debra, pro-family finances stance makes sense with the information they have, and their actions in the end scene make sense. Robert, you can definitely tell he's a great brother when it comes to his interaction with Ray. His reaction when he sees the guy that came for the old lady is Ray is priceless. Debra, her reaction in the beginning, her reaction in the end, definitely makes sense given everything that's happened. And the fact that she doesn't yell outright at Ray like in the previous episode with the meatballs, it shows some maturity on her part, because it'd be so easy for Debra to just rant and rave at Ray, which she was kind of expecting. But the way Patricia plays it to where it's restrained anger and I'd say a little bit more disappointment definitely shows her skills as an actress, and the conversations she and Ray pull off definitely make them a believable married couple. Andy, for the one scene he's in, believable, especially when he sees just how bad Ray is at managing the finances. And Tom's writing and the directing of the episode all make this an excellent episode. And for me, that's why I say it's one of the early great ones. And if it had been in the first, if you had placed it differently within the first couple seasons, it'd still be a great episode. It's just in a later season, it'd be a little out of place with everything around it, unless you modified certain things. Like change the age of the kids for one. The next episode kind of straddles the line of whether I'd say it's one of the early classic episodes, but it is another good to great episode. Especially ringing a chord with me now since I work in security, and every now and then we deal with police, and we have to deal with weird situations at work. Of course, the next one is Ray finally getting a taste of what his brother does for a living when he goes on a citizen ride-along.